Before we get to the construction of a government next chapter, however, we need to cover what it is that makes up a government, and one framework that I like is to use the one shown here, looking at government being made up of four concepts: power, authority, legitimacy, and sovereignty. Now, power is the ability of one entity, an individual, or an organization to control the actions of another. That is, to get someone to do what they want them to do, whether that person wants to or not. Now, if asked the question, where does the American government's power come from, a lot of us would point to things like elections and the Constitution and the political theories of John Locke. But strictly speaking, the government's power comes from two places: jails and tanks. What can the government do to you if you don't do what they want? Well, they can either put you in jail or they can bomb you. Those are the two fundamental means of coercion that the American government has. I mean, they can also fine you or tax you, but really the only reason that you then pay that tax or fine is because you're afraid you're going to jail or you're going to get bombed by a drone. So when we're looking at power by itself, we're just looking at the tools that the US government or our state governments or whatever the government in question is have to enforce compliance with their rules. Now, our inkling to say that power comes from elections, well, that's not actually the source of power. What that is that's a source of authority. Authority is what makes it right to use power. The government has power because they have nukes and because they have prisons, but it's right for the government to use power because they were duly elected or appointed by duly elected officials. Elections are the process by which citizens choose to whom they will confer authority, choosing who has the right to use power. This is, of course, broadly speaking, there are exceptions to this rule, but elections are the primary building block of authority in American government. Elections, however, aren't the only way that we confer authority onto a person. Here we see a man who certainly has some degree of power, but the Pope's right to use power comes not from election, or at least not a direct democratic election anyway, but rather from the belief structure of the people who recognize his authority. I happen to think that the current Pope is a pretty cool and groovy guy, but I'm not a Catholic, and therefore he does not officially have any form of authority over me. Another situation involving authority is a pretty far cry from the Pope. This lady here, Judge Judy. What you see on Judge Judy is not an actual court process. That's not how trials or hearings work. But the money exchanged at the end, the ruling that they come up with, is ultimately real. The reason why the system works is because both parties have agreed, for whatever reason, that they will abide by Judge Judy's ruling. They have given her the right to use power, making her the authority figure in that process. We've actually already had some exposure to the concept of authority through the Milgram experiment video. The scientists in the video had the power to manipulate people into doing things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do, such as administering a lethal electric shock, because the participants recognized the scientists as an authority. After authority comes legitimacy, and legitimacy is just a systemic way of deciding who gets to have authority. For our national government, the system that we have for determining what figures have authority and what their authority covers is through our Constitution, a written compact between people and government establishing the boundaries of the government's authority and where and how it is right for the government to use power. If the government takes action that is outside the bounds of the Constitution, that action is, to our system, illegitimate. Now, this obviously isn't the only system for establishing legitimacy. According to Thomas Hobbes, a government is made legitimate because it solves the problems of freedom and serves the commonwealth of the people. Friedrich Nietzsche's doctrine of a call to power effectively justifies might makes right as a form of legitimacy. There are countless systems through which one can systemically decide what bodies hold legitimate authority, as long as there is some form of widely accepted means for making this determination, it can be seen as a form of legitimacy. The last test, though, is sovereignty. Can a legitimate government exercise power within its borders? Can the government enforce its laws? For a pair of case studies in problems of sovereignty, we need to turn our eyes southwards. The first one is actually a good bit amusing. What we see here is Mexico City, and we have Peodonito, the little pedestrian. Fed up with the fact that cars were blocking the crosswalks and ignoring pedestrian rights, and most importantly, that police officers weren't doing anything about it, Peodonito decided that his only option was to take the enforcement of the law into his own hand, dress up as a luchador, and start banging on cars that violated the law and physically pushing them out of the crosswalk. In his eyes, the Mexican government was failing its test of sovereignty because it was failing to enforce its own laws. Pobre Peodonito. But keep in mind, Peodonito is not a legitimate figure. There is no way in which he actually has the right to use that power, at least no formal way, no legitimate way in which he holds authority here. A much more serious failure of sovereignty in Mexico lately, though, could be seen as the Mexican government lifting its ban on vigilantism when it comes to the war on drug lords. They have quite simply said that they will allow vigilantes to fight drug crime on their own, clearly calling into question whether or not the government can control what goes on within its borders. Similarly, U.S. troops and forces were needed and continue to be needed in Colombia's struggle against narco-terrorist organizations such as FARC. If the Colombian government is dependent on U.S. assistance to control its borders and to enforce its laws, is it still the government? It is, but it lacks sovereignty, at least in that area. Whereas the U.S. government is almost fully sovereign over its own borders, many of our southern neighbors have deeply troubling questions about their ability to self-govern. So if we go back and take a look at our building blocks, what we have is, at the very base, the most simple is power, the ability to get people to follow the rules, authority, what makes it right to use power, legitimacy, the system through which you decide how someone has authority or what authority an individual holds, and then lastly, sovereignty. Does the whole thing work top to bottom? If we look at the way that these building blocks are set up in the United States, or really any Western classical liberal tradition, then the level at the very bottom, power, is the criminal justice system, the armed forces that have some sort of accountability to elected leadership. The level above that of authority, well, they have their authority from free and fair elections in which most citizens can participate. That is a legitimate process. We've established this process through a written constitution, and sovereignty is, does the entire thing work? This isn't the only system that these building blocks can be aligned in. Let's take a look at a radical theocracy. A form of power is all dissenters and heretics will be executed in the streets and face eternal torment hereafter. This is laid down by the authority figure of church-appointed officials, and that's a legitimate system because of religious texts. This isn't the system for me, this isn't the system that most of us desire, but we can see how the same building blocks build a very different system of government. And the ultimate question is, does it work? Will it blend? Does sovereignty rest on top? Can this system control its own borders? Another one that certainly isn't for me, authoritarian socialism, communism. The root of power in a Soviet Union-style government or a Mao Zedong-style government, labor camps and a centrally controlled military. That's what gets people to follow the rules. What is the authority figure? Well, it is party leadership. Why is that authority a legitimate authority? Because it is the will of the people and the continuing revolution. And atop it all, the question of sovereignty. Or really just strip it of any sort of nouns, we get our broadly speaking questions. The question of power. Okay, if I don't do what you want, what's going to happen to me? And then the question of authority. Oh yeah, says who? The question of legitimacy. Why do they get to make that decision? And then lastly, at the end, the big question of, does this entire thing actually work? Any system of government that you take a look at will in some way have an answer to these four questions.